Hey, this is Dave with Taboo Customs. This video today we're going to cover the removal and the reinstallation of a steering box in our 95 Cherokee. Before we get started unbolting the steering box from the Jeep, we're going to have to remove or disconnect three things. We're going to have to disconnect the drag link or the Pitman arm. Then we're also going to have to remove the power steering hoses, the high pressure hose and the low pressure hose. And then we're going to have to uncouple the steering shaft from the front of the box so that we can go ahead and unbolt the box. So first thing let's take a look at the Pitman and drag link area of the box and talk about what you'll need to do there. Alright, so for the Pitman arm here, you can see that we've already removed the drag link from our Pitman arm, and we did that in a video we did earlier on how to remove the Dana 30 from your Jeep Cherokee. So if you really want to see that, you can go there. But it usually isn't too bad. Usually a 3/4 inch socket to take the nut at the top. Make sure you pull the cotter pin out first though, because it is a castle nut. Then once you get that nut off, I would recommend putting it on for a few threads, and then you can use a pickle fork to break this loose, or you can try to hit it from the top side to knock this down there. So the other option, of course, is to pull the Pitman arm off. Now, to pull the Pitman arm off, obviously you've got a large nut here that you've got to remove. And then really the only way we would recommend doing it is getting an actual Pitman arm puller to try to pry this off. Usually it's not going to come off very easily. Honestly, you don't want it to come off easily. It's the one thing, if it did fall off, you've got no steering. So get a Pitman arm puller, pull this off. Usually doesn't go too bad with a decent Pitman arm puller. Now, whether you pull the drag link off or pull the full Pitman off is really depending on what you're trying to do. Now, with this vehicle, we're replacing the front axle, and we're replacing this box completely with a new box with a new Pitman arm that's actually already drilled for our new drag link. So we didn't pull the Pitman arm off, we just pulled the drag link off. But that's going to be up to you. A lot of times you're probably going to go ahead and pull the Pitman arm off. Now when you do pull this Pitman arm off, it is keyed, so there's really only one way you can go back on. So you don't have to worry too much on figuring out where this Pitman arm is stock. You can go ahead and just pull it off. So let's go to the top and we'll take a look at the steering shaft, and we'll take a look at the hoses. Okay, so for the hoses, you've got two hoses going to the steering box. You've got a hose that connects to the bottom area of the reservoir for the power steering here, and it'll run down to the box. This is the low pressure hose. Then you've got a hose here that is, you'll see it's a hydraulically crimped hose. Looks kind of like air conditioning hoses would be, and that's because this is a high pressure hose. So this hose here, you're definitely going to have to unbolt from the steering box. One option, if you want to, you can take it off up here. It might be a little bit easier, but this down here isn't actually too bad. Now, on the low pressure hose, you have a couple of options. Now, this here, it's usually just a pressure clamp. You don't have a bolted fitting at the top, but I would warn you against removing it up here at the reservoir. You can often get this clamp off pretty easily, but sometimes getting the hose off, which actually this one doesn't look too bad, if the hose is stuck on there and will not come off at all, this little plastic fitting on the back here can break out of your reservoir, and if you do that, you're going to have to replace the reservoir. The good news is you can buy the reservoir separate. Bad news is you're going to have to take your steering pump off to get it, because you have to remove the little clips to be able to get it out. Now for ours here, what we're going to do is we go and we twist it a little bit, and it looks like it's actually pretty loose on there because it'll spin pretty freely on the back here. So we're going to go ahead and try to remove it from that. Now remember, when you do remove this from the back of your reservoir is still filled, so you're going to have a lot of fluid that spills out. So first thing we'll do, we'll go ahead and remove this. Then we'll remove our high pressure hose. For our high pressure hose, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to use a line wrench, and we'll show you that when we get there, and hopefully we can get it down in there and get it fit into the space that we need to work. Okay, so once you take the low pressure hose off you can open this up if you want to increase the drain flow out of here to let it drain. Then if you have something to plug it up, it'll help if you can just put a plug or over inside of that hole there just to keep it from dripping on you so much. Then you'll need to take the high pressure hose off. Now the high pressure hose will use an 18 millimeter wrench. We don't know where our line wrench is actually at, and a line wrench is an open end wrench. Well, it kind of looks like a box end wrench, but only with 6 points, and it has a slot in it. And the reason for that is that it fits over the line, and you can get more grip onto the nut, and it helps to keep from rounding it out, because you're not here when you're turning this, you're only putting pressure on 2 of the corners of the nut. Here, when you've got all 6 points, you put the pressure on all 6 points. So it really helps to keep from rounding them out. But this Jeep's came apart pretty good, so I think we'll probably end up getting it pretty well. Now you really just barely have enough space down in here, typically, to get your wrench in there and try to loosen it up. Hopefully, once it's loose, you may have to hit it a couple of times here. Eventually, you can unthread it with your fingers. Now, being that the low pressure hose goes over the high pressure hose, you can have some trouble trying to pull it out if you didn't loosen up the fitting for the low pressure hose. Which, I mean, you can kind of pull on the low pressure hose and bend it a little bit, try to get the high pressure hose enough space, or you can, obviously remove it from the steering box, which is the other option. Sometimes it's just kind of difficult to get in there. There you go. We'll let it drain a little bit, and we'll go ahead and we'll pull it up and we'll kind of hook it up here. Now, one thing to remember, one thing you're going to want to check out is check out the condition of your O-rings down here at the bottom of the hose. If you left it in the box or if it's tore up, you're going to want to get it and replace it. Alright, so next we'll take a look at the steering shaft. Okay, so the coupler to the steering box and the steering shaft is right down here. And there's a bolt here that goes through that coupler that tightens down on the shaft. Now, the easiest way to remove that bolt is to get it so the head of the bolt is actually on the bottom. It's easier to remove coming up through the bottom than it is to try to make your way through all this and use a ratchet down in here. So this is for us, a 13 millimeter socket to remove this bolt. And we'll go ahead and we'll completely remove that bolt to make sure we have no tension on here. And then on some steering boxes, I don't think on Cherokees they have them, there's sometimes a divot in there that if you leave the bolt in there, that'll make it hard to get the steering shaft off, or impossible to get it off. So now that we have this bolt out, what we're going to do is we're going to want to use something that we can put down in here and pry against the steering box to try to force the shaft off. Alright, so now that we've got our bolt out of the coupling at the bottom of the shaft, we need to remove the coupling from the box. The problem is, though, this is a 95. And in the early 90s, the Cherokees used a non-slip steering shaft. So you cannot really slide this shaft back up like you can on some later Cherokees that had a shaft that would actually slip in and out and be able to slide in and out. So we're going to actually have to unbolt the box to be able to separate the shaft from the box. So now we're basically to the point to where we can start to unbolt our box. Okay, so to actually remove the box, we've got 3 bolts down here. We've got these 2 bolts here, for the bottom, and then we've got one up here at the top. And so we're going to start with removing this top bolt, because for us right now it's going to be the hardest to get to. We've got a bumper bracket here, and you've got this fender bracket in the way, or this bracket here in the fender area in the way as well. These two bolts down here are pretty easy to get to, so we'll leave them for last because we can hold the box and remove those bolts at the same time. Okay, so these bolts here, I should have mentioned, are we used a 5/8 socket on them. I believe a 16 millimeter is pretty close as well. So now the steering box, we're going to support the steering box and try prying away our shaft. Once you get it down here, you got an aluminum spacer which just fell on me. And then as you see, you can kind of just lower the steering box and it'll just kind of drop out of the shaft, or you may have to pry it just a little bit. So here's our box that we just took out of the Cherokee. This is an existing Cherokee box. What we're going to be putting back into the Cherokee is actually a early 90s YJ box. So the one thing to check for is, make sure that your splines here are the same on the box. You don't want to start trying to put this box in there, especially because that's not a slip steering shaft. It's going to make it really hard if this doesn't fit up in there really nice. It's going to be a real pain to get in there. So one thing though that is different between these two steering boxes is one of the mounting points. In the YJ steering box, you've got 4 mounting points. You've got this extra mounting point up here that the Cherokee box does not have. Now, that's not a huge issue going from the Cherokee box to a YJ box. Basically, this mount is up above the unibody, doesn't interfere with anything, so it will fit up in there fine. So one thing with the Cherokee box we do also have is you've got this spacer that spaces it out from the unibody frame. This is an aluminum spacer, and sometimes this thing can be a massive pain in the butt. The reason for that, and you can kind of see it down in here a little bit, is that these spacers, being that they're aluminum and the bolts that are going through them are steel, will end up having galvanic corrosion. So we have at times found that the bolts have seized up inside of these spacers, especially in really salty regions or where we use a lot of salt on our roads. They'll seize up in here and actually break off. So a lot of times people replace these spacers with steel ones. This one here, however, is still in great shape, so we're going to go ahead and reuse a spacer with our new box. Now, the big reason that we are going with this new box versus keeping the Cherokee box is that we will be doing hydraulic assist. So this box was already set up for hydraulic assist. It's already drilled, tapped, it's got the ports in it. It also already has the Pitman arm that we need for the drag link in our high steer steering on our Dana 60. So that's why we're going through the effort of changing this out. Now first, before I go to try to reinstall this, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to mimic the location of the flat section here as well as our Pitman arm. So that way I know that our steering shaft should hopefully line up. So our flat section on our stock Cherokee box was basically down here towards the bottom, so we'll put this one down here towards the bottom. Then I'm going to take a brush, clean up these threads really good to try to get that bolt to slide on, or that coupler to slide on there easily, and then we'll go ahead and try wrestling it back into the Jeep. Okay, so time to wrestle this box back in. Now before we start wrestling the box in, what we've done is we've taken this aluminum spacer and we've gone ahead and we've put it up here. We actually put the bolts through here to help hold it up there so it doesn't fall down. Now if you don't do this before, it shouldn't be a big issue. You could probably slide it in, but we're going to try to keep it up there. And you can see on this aluminum spacer, you got the 2 holes down here at the bottom, and then that 1 hole that's farther goes up here at the top. And this is actually the area here where, because we're using the YJ box, this is where that extra mounting point is going to be but it won't be in the way of anything because there's really nothing up there. So the first thing to rest it in, the first thing you're going to want to focus on is making sure that you line up the steering shaft with the shaft coming out of the box. So once we get those to slide in, what we can do is kind of pivot the box up there and set it on this ledge here. So you do have a ledge that will kind of hold it up there, and then we'll work on getting the bolt started. Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about that pain in the butt. So we hoped that the shaft would slide on easily. Of course, it didn't. So what we had to do is get it lined up as best we could. We stuck it up in there so it stopped. Now, obviously, with a second person here, it'd be a lot easier to line that shaft up and be able to tap it on. So then what we did was we had to go up with a shaft and a hammer and basically start tapping the shaft here to try to push it on. And of course, it didn't want to go on very easily. It was correctly lined up. We checked that a couple of times, and it just didn't want to slide on real easy. So about a 32nd at a time, shaft slid on. After getting it on about a 3/8 of an inch or so, half inch, we pulled this over and stuck a bolt in it. That was mainly to protect my dog in case it wanted to fall and make me bleed again as usual. So after that, after we got the bolt in there quite a ways, we went ahead and we could, kind of go after it a little bit more because we didn't have to worry about it falling. So now the next step is we need to make sure that the rest of these bolts in the spacer, and you can kind of feel the bolt in the spacer up in there, we'll need to line those up and get those tightened up. Now the shaft here, it's actually right now it's already pushed all the way against the steering box. We'll actually pry that out a little bit, the correct positions, about an 1/8 inch of gap between the shaft and the steering box, and we'll be able to put that other bolt in. But right now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on lining up these bolts, getting them lined up, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take some blue Loctite, and one bolt at a time we'll blue Loctite them, and then we will tighten them down to 70 foot-pounds. After that, we'll go ahead, reconnect, you'll put the bolt back in our shaft, we'll put some Loctite on it as well, and then we will hook up our high pressure line. Okay, well, I don't even notice, but I had a little bit of issue torquing it down, and I got really concerned there for a second because on that upper bolt it's a real pain to get to sometimes. We're using like a 6-inch extension to get to it. Well, as we're tightening that bolt down, the torque wrench clicked, but then when I went to hit it a second time, because I usually will at least hit the torque wrench 2 times just to make sure we're torqued right. And it kept tightening down, so it's like, oh man, hopefully it'd be odd to strip out either the bolt or the threads in this, because they're both high strength. And what had actually happened was something that happened was someone at one time, probably because they had trouble getting to that bolt up there and they're afraid of it loosening, had actually put a split washer on the bolt. Well, when they did that, I actually put one that probably is a bit large. So as we were torquing it down there, and I didn't notice, there's no split washers that typically go on there. Typically it's, you know, Loctite, correct torque. And well, what happened is that split washer actually went over the head of the bolt. So when we hit that torque, must have been that split washer going over it. So we'll have to pop that off and then put the bolt back in there. Okay, so now the last couple things left is going to be hook up our drag link and also go up top and we'll re-hook up the lines for the drag link. Obviously it's pretty simple. We're going to have to unlock the steering wheel though, adjust our Pitman arm to where we need it, and then push our drag link up through there and tighten it down. Of course, when you do that, go ahead and check your drag link joint, make sure it's not loose. If it spins by hand or you feel it move at all, it's no good. So go ahead and replace that this time. But for now, we'll go up and we'll finish up by hooking up the hoses up top. Okay, so now to put the hoses back on, one of the things you can do to make it a little bit easier on yourself is we've taken a ratchet strap and just put a little bit of back pressure on the radiator hose to get it away, because the key thing with putting these lines back in is making sure you get them square into the steering box. You don't want to cross thread this because it's, you know, obviously in an area that's a real pain. So make sure you are really you know, cognizant of getting it in there straight and starting it by hand first and making sure that it's really threaded in there correctly and not cross threading it. You know, that's a real pain. Since we're not, you know, we already left the low pressure hose installed, we don't have to worry about that. And since we're using a little bit, it's got a little bit different design to it, we don't actually have to worry about its interference with the high pressure hose. Now typically if you took both of these hoses out, now the threads are a different size, so you shouldn't be able to put them in the wrong place, and you'd want to go ahead and do the high pressure hose first and then the low pressure hose, since it does go over the high pressure hose. It is a little bit easier that way, but we didn't even take the low pressure hose out, so we're not going to worry about it. Now like I said, make sure it's going straight down into there. Sometimes you need to wiggle it and take a look and see if it's going in straight or not. Okay, so there we go. So we've got it threaded in there now. It's threaded in there correctly, so we can go ahead and we can start tightening it down. We're going to go ahead and let the ratchet strap off because the main purpose of this was to, you know, if you don't, the hoses, the top of these metal hoses will actually hit this this line, this coolant, the radiator hose here. Makes it real pain to try to get them lined up correctly, and it can cause you to get them cross-threaded, and you definitely don't want that. Okay, so these are O-ring fittings, so I mean you want them tight, but they don't have to be extremely tight. They will seal themselves, and really they don't really have an issue with coming loose. Typically just make sure it's pretty good and tight. Now we'll go ahead and route the new low pressure line here, and again be aware that you want to be careful at this section of this reservoir so you don't break it off. So that does it. Now we can go ahead, fill up our reservoir, and check our steering. So thanks for watching. As always, if this video helped, you know, like or subscribe is appreciated. If you want to ask us a question or make a comment, you can get a hold of us on our Facebook page, Taboo Customs, or contact us at our website, taboocustoms.com. Thanks again.